The hum of the server racks, a low, constant thrum, was the truest companion in my world of numbers. It was a rhythm I knew intimately, a pulse beneath the cool, regulated air of my office. For me, Thomas, the universe resided in ledgers, in the crisp precision of a balance sheet, in the stark, unyielding truth of figures. Each digit, each decimal point, a star in a vast, intricate constellation. My work, forensic accounting, was the art of charting those stars, of finding the faintest tremor in their ancient light. Today, my gaze was fixed on the accounts of Horizon Global, a client whose name alone whispered of limitless reach, a behemoth of international trade. The firm prided itself on their patronage, a jewel in our corporate crown. I was deep into their quarterly audit, a task usually as predictable as the tide, a comforting ritual of verification. My fingers danced across the keyboard, a silent ballet of keystrokes navigating through layers of data, spreadsheets blooming across my triple monitors like digital gardens. Each transaction a leaf, each ledger a branch. I was sifting through a series of capital expenditures, a routine check for discrepancies, when a flicker caught my eye. Not an error, not yet. More like a misplaced shadow in an otherwise brightly lit room. A series of payments, substantial sums, channeled through a subsidiary I barely recognized, Coastal Logistics Solutions. The name itself was innocuous, but its sudden prominence in Horizon Global's outflow felt unbalanced, like a single heavy stone placed on a finely tuned scale. I clicked deeper, following the digital thread. Coastal Logistics Solutions, I found, was a relatively new entity, barely 2 years old, yet its transactions were growing exponentially. The usual due diligence reports offered little beyond boilerplate generalities: shipping services, import/export facilitation. Vague enough to be legitimate, but my gut, a seasoned divining rod for anomalies, twitched. My fingers flew, opening new windows, cross-referencing vendor lists, checking registration details. Coastal Logistics Solutions, it turned out, was registered to a small, nondescript office in a forgotten corner of the city, an address that didn't quite gel with the sheer volume of funds flowing through it. It was like finding a river pouring from a teacup. This wasn't just a flicker now, it was a persistent, irritating buzz. Then came the first true discord, a note struck jarringly off-key. A payment of several 100,000 credits, marked simply as storage fees, directed from Horizon Global to Coastal Logistics. The date stood out, a Tuesday in late autumn, but the accompanying documentation, a single poorly scanned invoice, listed the service as provided at a specific address. The warehouse district, loading dock, camera blind spot. The words themselves, stark and unembellished, felt like a sudden drop in the elevator of my composure. Camera blind spot. My mind snagged on it, the phrase repeating, echoing in the quiet of my office. Why would an invoice explicitly mention a camera blind spot? It wasn't a descriptor for location, but for concealment. A shiver, light as a spider's thread, traced its way down my spine. I tried to rationalize it away. Perhaps a quirky internal code, a misplaced memo, but the meticulous part of me, the part that lived for patterns and despised inconsistencies, rejected the notion. I pulled up satellite images of the mentioned address. It was indeed a vast expanse of industrial buildings, a maze of corrugated steel and concrete. I zoomed in, pinpointing the specific loading dock. My eyes searched for any external security cameras, and yes, there they were, mounted high, overlooking the main access points. But around the particular dock specified in the invoice, there was an unmistakable gap in their watchful gaze, a distinct zone of unmonitored space. It was too precise to be coincidence. This wasn't a simple accounting error, a misplaced decimal. This was deliberate. My focus narrowed, sharpening to a razor's edge. I traced other payments to Coastal Logistics, searching for similar anomalies. They weren't always as blatant as camera blind spot, but once I knew what to look for, the subtle tells began to emerge. Unusual hours of operation listed on delivery receipts, vague descriptions of goods, vastly inflated expediting fees for seemingly mundane shipments. The sums involved were staggering. Millions, then tens of millions, cycling through this seemingly insignificant logistics company. And the pattern: large transfers from Horizon Global, broken into smaller, less conspicuous chunks by Coastal Logistics, then dispersed to a network of offshore accounts and shell corporations, their digital fingerprints leading to dead ends in distant, sun-baked islands or anonymous, glass-towered financial hubs. This wasn't just storage fees or shipping services. This was a complex, sophisticated mechanism designed to obscure, to cleanse, to vanish. Money laundering. Horizon Global, this pillar of international commerce, was a conduit. My meticulous nature, my dedication to truth in numbers, had led me not to a simple error but to something far more sinister, something that hummed with the dangerous energy of organized crime. My office, usually a sanctuary of order, now felt like a cage. The server hum, once a comfort, now sounded like a low, warning growl. The air, crisp moments before, now felt thick with an unseen presence. My fingers, which had so confidently navigated the digital labyrinth, now hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. I had found the glitch in the system, and the system, I knew, would not take kindly to being exposed. I had to understand the full scope of this. I was no longer just an accountant. I was a witness. And the truth, I suspected, was about to become my most dangerous asset. The stark, unyielding truth of the numbers had carved itself into my mind. The server's gentle sigh had become a mocking whisper, a chorus to the phantom echoes of manipulated digits. I, Thomas, had seen the ledger's heart, and it was black. A complex tapestry of shell companies, phantom invoices, and offshore transfers, all woven with the meticulous, almost artistic, precision of a master craftsman. This was no mere error. It was a deliberate, sophisticated act of financial alchemy, transforming illicit gains into clean, respectable capital. Money laundering on a scale that made my stomach clench. My initial reaction, a surge of adrenaline mixed with righteous indignation, demanded immediate action. My firm, a bastion of integrity, or so I believed, would surely want to excise this rot. The path seemed clear. Present the irrefutable evidence, expose the perpetrators, and restore the firm's untarnished reputation. I gathered my digital files, encrypted and triple-checked, a fortress of proof against any denial. My fingers, usually so steady navigating spreadsheets, trembled slightly as I composed an urgent request for a meeting with the senior partner, my immediate superior. A knot tightened in my gut. This wasn't merely a complex audit. It felt like unearthing a buried secret, one that hummed with a dangerous energy. The senior partner's office was a study in polished mahogany and muted ambition. Sunlight, filtered through tall windows, cast long shadows across the Persian rug. He leaned back in his leather chair, a portrait of measured calm as I laid out my findings. My voice, usually calm and analytical, carried an edge of urgency I couldn't quite suppress. I spoke of the intricate web, the impossible profit margins, the suspicious lack of paper trails in key areas. I watched his face, searching for the expected flicker of alarm, the furrow of concern. Instead, a slight, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. "Thomas," he began, his voice a smooth, low current, "my diligence is, as always, commendable, a keen eye indeed." He paused, picking up a heavy silver letter opener, turning it idly in his fingers. "However, these discrepancies, the market can be volatile, can't it? And international finance, a labyrinth even for the most seasoned explorers. Perhaps a misinterpretation of certain fluctuating variables, or an overzealous application of a new algorithm." My internal alarm bells shrieked. Misinterpretation. This wasn't a fuzzy variable, it was a gaping black hole in the firm's accounts, filled with money that shouldn't exist. "Sir," I pressed, my voice firmer, "the patterns are too consistent, the numbers too perfectly aligned for mere market fluctuation. It points to deliberate manipulation. The client's reported profits compared to their actual operational footprint are simply not plausible." He waved a dismissive hand, the silver glinting. Plausibility, Thomas, is often in the eye of the beholder. We have many clients with unique business models, ones that defy conventional analysis. Rest assured, the firm has robust internal controls. Perhaps I rest seeing phantoms in the ledger, born of too much late-night analysis. His gaze, though genial, held a peculiar weight, a quiet suggestion that I was overstepping. I'd suggest I shift my focus to the upcoming merger audit. He hadn't even truly looked at the data. He hadn't asked for specifics, hadn't called for an immediate investigation. He had simply dismissed it. The words were soft, yet their implications were hard, unyielding. Phantoms. My meticulous work, my years of training, reduced to a figment of an overactive imagination. It didn't add up. The senior partner, usually so sharp, so quick to pounce on any hint of financial impropriety, was deliberately turning a blind eye. The corruption, I realized with a sickening lurch, might reach higher than I'd ever conceived. Undeterred, a stubborn fire now lit in my chest, I sought out the firm's managing director the next day. This was a man renowned for his uncompromising stance on ethics, a figurehead of corporate integrity. His office, higher up in the skyscraper, offered a panoramic view of the city, a sprawling testament to power and commerce. I presented my case again, this time with even greater detail, anticipating a more receptive audience, a champion for truth. The managing director listened, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Thomas," he said, his voice devoid of the senior partner's false geniality, "I am a valued member of our team. My analytical mind is exceptional. We appreciate my dedication to the firm's well-being." He leaned forward, his eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, now held a disconcerting flatness. "However, certain investigations, particularly those touching on our most sensitive client relationships, require a delicate touch, a nuanced understanding of the broader ecosystem." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, heavy and unspoken. Unnecessary scrutiny can disrupt delicate balances. It can lead to misunderstandings. And misunderstandings, Thomas, can have unforeseen consequences, not just for the firm but for individuals who might, inadvertently, become entangled. His gaze held mine, unwavering, a quiet current of warning flowing between us. It would be a shame for such a promising career to be derailed by an unfortunate misunderstanding of the firm's priorities. I trust I comprehend the gravity of what I am conveying. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. There was no mistaking the message. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, a threat thinly veiled in corporate euphemisms. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and indignation. They weren't just ignoring it, they were actively protecting it. The firm, my sanctuary of order and truth, was implicated. My world, built on the bedrock of numbers and logic, had just tilted violently on its axis. That evening, the city's lights blurred through my windshield as I drove, a numb ache settling behind my eyes. The conversation echoed, each phrase a hammer blow against my conviction. I felt watched, exposed. My usual route home felt too familiar, too vulnerable. Impulsively, I veered off, navigating the labyrinthine back roads until I found myself in the warehouse district, loading dock, camera, blind spot. I often used this area as a shortcut. Its quiet industrial anonymity, a stark contrast to the gleaming towers downtown. It was a place I knew to be unmonitored by the ubiquitous eyes of the city, a small pocket of forgotten concrete and corrugated steel. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and damp concrete. My gaze drifted to a familiar, chipped concrete pillar at the edge of the loading dock, a spot where rainwater often pooled. And there, tucked neatly into a crevice, was a small, perfectly folded origami crane fashioned from a crisp dollar bill. It wasn't mine. I hadn't seen anything like it before. My breath hitched. The intricate fold, the deliberate placement. It was a silent, elegant message, a calling card. Someone knew where I went, where I sought solace, where I thought I was unseen. My heart began to hammer, a frantic drum against my ribs. This wasn't just about my career anymore. This was a direct, chilling whisper in the dark, a promise of unseen eyes and hands. The world I knew, the one I had meticulously ordered with numbers, had just shown me its teeth, and I was alone. The firm, a monolith of glass and steel, had shown its true face. The hushed words of the executive, a silk scarf around his throat, still echoed in the quiet chambers of my mind. Discretion, reputational risk, reevaluation of priorities. It wasn't just a refusal to acknowledge the rot. It was a deliberate act of concealment, a tightening of the shroud. My stomach, a knot of cold iron, had since settled into a hard resolve. Fear, a bitter draught, had been swallowed, replaced by a clarity born of betrayal. I would not be silenced. The nights became my new office. My apartment, once a sanctuary of quiet order, transformed into a war room. The company network, a fortress now locked against me, was no longer an option. I worked in the digital wilderness, tracing faint echoes in public databases, cross-referencing names, addresses, and corporate filings. The initial threads were gossamer thin, a series of offshore entities registered in sun-drenched islands, their ownership structures designed with the elegant complexity of a spider's web. They weren't just shell companies, they were Russian dolls, each revealing another, smaller, more opaque entity within. What struck me was the sheer volume, the relentless proliferation. It wasn't just a handful of dubious transactions, it was a deluge. A financial tide washing over borders, leaving no discernible footprint. I found a particular cluster of these entities, all linked by a single, obscure legal firm in a country known for its financial privacy. They shared a common director, a name that appeared on hundreds of corporate registrations, a ghost in the machine. But what truly pulled at the fabric of my understanding were the commodity trades. Not the grand, headline-grabbing deals, but smaller, almost insignificant movements of bulk goods, industrial chemicals, construction materials, even a baffling series of transactions involving rare earth minerals, all valued just below the threshold that would trigger closer scrutiny. It was the pricing that didn't add up. These commodities, moving between the linked offshore companies, were consistently undervalued on export and overvalued on import, or vice versa, depending on the direction of the flow. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift that, when aggregated across hundreds of transactions, accounted for millions. A quiet siphon, draining wealth from one account and depositing it, cleansed into another. This wasn't petty fraud. It was a sophisticated, global financial artery, pumping illicit funds through the veins of legitimate trade. One particular series of transactions caught my eye, a recurring shipment of what was vaguely described as specialized industrial components between a holding company in the Seychelles and a distribution firm registered in a neighboring city. The declared value was always consistent, always just under the customs declaration threshold, and the weight of the cargo, according to the manifest, was substantial. Too substantial for the listed value. It was a discrepancy I couldn't ignore, a tiny crack in the elaborate facade. I spent hours mapping the logistics of these specialized components. The paper trail led from the offshore entity, through a series of intermediate companies, and ultimately pointed to a specific point of entry, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of the city. The digital breadcrumbs ended there at the edge of the physical world. A Tuesday night, under a sky bruised purple with impending rain, I found myself driving. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and distant industry. I left the paved roads behind, navigating through a labyrinth of forgotten streets, the streetlights growing sparser, their yellow glow fighting a losing battle against the encroaching gloom. The address I'd traced led me to the warehouse district, loading dock, camera blind spot. It was a desolate stretch of concrete and metal, a forgotten corner where the city's eyes did not reach. My headlights, cautious beams, swept across a row of shuttered bays, their metal doors scarred with rust and neglect. A single, flickering fluorescent light hummed above one of the docks, casting a sickly yellow pallor on the peeling paint. I parked my car a street away, nestled between two abandoned trailers, their tires flat, their paint faded. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I felt exposed, vulnerable, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape of industrial decay. This was no longer about numbers on a screen. This was real, tangible, and terrifying. From my vantage point, concealed by the skeletal remains of a forgotten structure, I watched. The blind spot was exactly as the schematic suggested, a precise gap in the surveillance coverage, an arc untouched by the silent gaze of the security cameras mounted on the warehouse corners. It was deliberate, meticulously planned. After what felt like an eternity, a low rumble vibrated through the ground. A heavy-duty truck, its engine a throaty growl, pulled into the loading dock. Its lights, two piercing eyes, cut through the gloom. It backed slowly, precisely, into the camera blind spot, its rear obscuring the activity from any distant watchful lens. My breath hitched. This wasn't a random delivery. This was choreographed. They moved with a practiced efficiency, unlocking the rear of the trailer. What they unloaded wasn't specialized industrial components. Not in the conventional sense. Instead, they began to offload wooden crates, each no larger than a footlocker but clearly heavy by the way they handled them. They moved with a quiet urgency, stacking the crates inside the warehouse opening. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing down. It wasn't industrial machinery they were moving. The way the crates were handled, the hushed tones of the figures, the careful placement, it spoke of something far more precious, far more illicit. I couldn't see inside the crates, but the sheer volume, the methodical precision, the designated blind spot. It screamed of value, of something that needed to be kept hidden. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The undervalued commodity shipments, the shell companies, and now these silent, furtive movements in the dead of night. This wasn't just money laundering. This was also trafficking. Whatever was in those crates, it was the physical manifestation of the clean money, or perhaps the raw material for even more illicit gains. A wave of nausea washed over me. My firm, was complicit in this. I was no longer just an accountant. I was a witness, an unwilling participant. The numbers had led me to this desolate place, and now the reality of it threatened to consume me. Was I truly prepared for this? The thought, a flicker of doubt, passed quickly, extinguished by the image of the executive's smug face and the silent, menacing dance of the figures in the blind spot. There was no turning back. Discretion, reputational risk, reevaluation of priorities. It wasn't just a refusal to acknowledge the rot. It was a silent, chilling endorsement. My initial attempts to prick the corporate conscience had merely revealed the depth of the infection. The numbers, once a source of comforting certainty, now thrummed with a sinister energy, demanding further scrutiny, a deeper plunge into the murky currents they represented. The following days unfurled with a strange, unsettling rhythm, a subtle shift in the city's hum, a discordant note in the symphony of my routine. I began to perceive the periphery with a new, sharp clarity. The same dark sedan, its windows tinted like obsidian, parked 2 blocks from my apartment building on consecutive mornings. A trick of the light, I told myself, a common model in a sprawling metropolis. My commute, once a predictable dance of traffic and pedestrian flow, transformed into a meticulous study of reflections. The convex mirror of a bus shelter, the polished chrome of a parked motorcycle, the fleeting glance in a shop window, each became a momentary canvas for observation. I saw the same face twice, a man with a nondescript cap and a newspaper held too still, once near the coffee shop I frequented, and again outside the grand entrance of the firm. My breath hitched. My mind, a labyrinth of numbers and logic, now seemed to twist itself into patterns of suspicion, each observation a data point demanding analysis. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, painting the office towers in hues of bruised purple, I found myself lingering. I sat at my desk, the glow of my monitor casting my face in an eerie pallor, the spreadsheets a mosaic of damning evidence. A faint click from the hallway, not a natural settling of the building, but something deliberate, too soft to be accidental. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. The building's security system was robust, I knew, yet a shiver traced its path down my spine. My heart, a frantic drum in my chest, argued with my rational mind. A janitor, perhaps. A late-night delivery. But the stillness that followed was too profound, too absolute. The next morning, a colleague, usually reserved, approached my desk with an uncharacteristic eagerness. "Thomas," he said, his voice a low murmur, "the executive was asking about your project." My project was a labyrinth, its internal milestones known only to me and my immediate supervisor, a detail-oriented manager whose focus rarely strayed beyond the quarterly reports. The executive's inquiry felt like a probe, a test of the waters, a gentle reminder of the firm's pervasive gaze. The pressure intensified, not with overt threats but with a subtle erosion of my sense of privacy. My phone, once a mere tool, now felt like a conduit for unseen listeners. Conversations with my family grew guarded, pruned of any reference to my work, a silent editing process that left a bitter taste. Even my home, a sanctuary built on trust and comfort, began to feel permeable. A misplaced book on my nightstand, a window slightly ajar that I swore I had closed, small disturbances, easily dismissed as forgetfulness or the quirks of an old house. But cumulatively they formed a mosaic of unsettling possibilities. I needed to move, to test the boundaries of this unseen net. My thoughts turned to the reams of data I had copied, the encrypted files I had hidden. The raw truth, stripped of corporate euphemisms, resided not within the firm's polished servers, but on a secured drive in my possession. I needed a place to think, to verify, to plan, away from the firm's pervasive reach, away from the subtle eyes that now seemed to follow my every move. One rain-slicked afternoon, I drove not to my apartment, but towards the city's underbelly, the industrial sprawl where the glittering skyline gave way to corrugated iron and weathered brick. My destination, the warehouse district, loading dock, camera blind spot. I had scouted it weeks ago, a forgotten pocket of urban decay, a small crevice in the city's electronic surveillance grid. I parked my car a block away, tucking it behind a derelict delivery van, its tires flat, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp concrete and something metallic, a memory of industry. I walked, my footsteps echoing faintly between towering stacks of empty pallets and discarded crates. Above, a tangle of pipes and wires formed a skeletal canopy. I knew the angle, the precise spot where the single, rusted security camera, mounted precariously on a bent pole, could not reach. It was an imperfect sanctuary, but for a moment it felt like freedom. I leaned against a cold metal pillar, pulling a small, encrypted thumb drive from my pocket. My fingers traced its cool surface. Here, I thought, was the key. Here was the evidence. A prickle on the back of my neck, a faint, almost imperceptible sound of gravel shifting. I spun around, my heart lurching. A utility van, nondescript and gray, idled at the far end of the dock, its engine a low growl. A figure sat in the driver's seat, indistinct through the grimy windshield. The van hadn't been there when I arrived. My eyes darted around, searching for an explanation, a delivery, a worker, anything to dispel the icy certainty that had just solidified in my gut. No other vehicles, no activity. Just the idling van and the unseen presence behind its glass. The camera might not see me, but they did. The game, I realized with a sickening lurch, had just begun. Discretion, reputational risk, reevaluation of priorities. It wasn't just a refusal to acknowledge the rot, it was a deliberate turning away, a complicity that curdled in my gut. They had known, they still knew, and now they knew I knew. A cold apprehension had begun to seep into the foundations of my daily existence, a subtle tremor beneath the polished surface of my life. I walked through my days with a new kind of vision, every shadow seeming deeper, every passing stranger holding a fraction more scrutiny. The numbers, once a refuge of order and logic, now screamed warnings from the periphery of my vision. The intricate web of shell companies and offshore accounts I had unearthed felt less like a puzzle to solve and more like a predator's snare, tightening around me. It was a place where the concrete met the river, where the air tasted of brine and exhaust fumes. My old sedan, usually a quiet cocoon, now felt exposed, a fragile shell against the encroaching vastness. I found the address, a hulking structure of corrugated metal and faded paint, its windows like vacant eyes. The area was a labyrinth of industrial decay, rusted gates, and forgotten loading bays. I parked a street away, slipping from my vehicle like a phantom, the cool evening air biting at my exposed skin. My breath plumed in front of me, a visible manifestation of the tension coiling in my chest. My eyes scanned for cameras, for any telltale gleam of a lens. Most were either broken, covered in grime, or pointed at empty stretches of wall. But there, tucked between two overflowing dumpsters, beside a derelict loading dock, I found it. A subtle indentation in the wall, a slight discoloration where a camera should have been, but wasn't. It was the perfect camera blind spot, a silent invitation to clandestine activity. The silence was punctuated only by the distant wail of a tugboat horn and the rustle of rats in unseen refuse. Hours bled into a dull ache in my limbs. Just as a sliver of doubt began to prick at my resolve, a low rumble vibrated through the asphalt. No logos, no distinguishing marks. Two figures emerged, moving with an almost mechanical efficiency, exchanging heavy crates with another, smaller vehicle that appeared from a side alley, its engine barely a murmur. The transaction was swift, silent, and utterly illicit. My fingers trembled as I fumbled for my phone, trying to capture something, anything, in the dim light. The lens of my device felt inadequate, a child's toy against the stark reality unfolding before me. Then a sudden, sharp vibration in my pocket, my wife. His voice, usually a calm anchor, was frayed, laced with a tremor that sent an immediate jolt of ice through my veins. "Thomas, I don't know what happened. The school bus. It had some kind of engine trouble. They dropped the children off at a temporary spot near the old flour mill on Cranbrook Road. It's such a strange place, darling, all those abandoned factories. Cranbrook Road." My mind, usually so precise, struggled to connect the dots. Cranbrook Road wound its way through the edge of this very district, just a few blocks from where I now crouched. This wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. I mumbled assurances, my heart racing, a trapped bird desperate for escape. I pushed myself up, abandoning my surveillance, the illicit exchange now a secondary concern. Family, my daughter. My legs burned, each stride a desperate prayer. As I burst onto Cranbrook Road, the scene unfolded in a slow-motion nightmare. My wife's car, a familiar splash of crimson in the monochrome landscape, was pulled sharply to the side, dangerously close to a crumbling brick wall. Its hazard lights blinked frantically, a desperate pulse in the gloom. And standing beside it, her small frame silhouetted against the car's headlights, was my daughter, her face a pale, tear-streaked canvas of fear. It was the same model as the smaller car I had seen at the loading dock, though I couldn't be certain it was the exact same one. The doubt, however, was fleeting. I reached them, my breath ragged, my voice choked. "Are you all right? What happened?" My wife turned, her eyes wide, glistening with unshed tears. Some maniac. He swerved right at me, Thomas, deliberately. I had to wrench the wheel. I almost hit that wall. He just laughed. I think he laughed. She clutched my daughter tighter, who was now sobbing into her mother's coat. As I comforted them, my gaze fell to the asphalt near the front tire of our car. There, amidst the grit and discarded wrappers, lay a small, folded piece of paper. It looked insignificant, a discarded scrap. My fingers, still trembling, reached for it. It was a partial printout of a spreadsheet, one I recognized instantly. It was a fragment of the very ledger I had been scrutinizing, the one that detailed the illicit transfers, the numbers I had highlighted in red. But on the back, scrawled in a crude, childish hand, was a drawing. A stick figure, undeniably my daughter, holding a flower beneath a misshapen sun, and scrawled beneath it a single stark word, Stop. The world tilted. The air grew thin, sharp. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a veiled threat from a boardroom. The executive's words, the firm's obstruction, the clandestine transactions in the warehouse district, they all coalesced into a single, terrifying truth. They knew everything. They knew about my investigation, and they had reached for the very heart of my existence. My illusion of safety, fragile as spun glass, shattered into a million piercing shards. They had crossed a line I hadn't even known existed until they trampled over it with callous disregard. I held my daughter tighter, burying my face in her hair, inhaling the innocent scent of shampoo and childhood. A silent, fierce vow formed in the deepest chambers of my being, hard and unyielding as granite. They wanted a fight. They would get one. I would expose them, every last one, no matter the cost, no matter the peril for her, for my wife, for everything I held dear. The meticulous accountant was gone. In his place, a determined, dangerous adversary had awakened. The raw scream of my wife still echoed in the hollow chambers of my skull, a siren song of terror that drowned out all other thought. My daughter's small body, shaking against her mother's, was a weight far heavier than any ledger I had ever balanced. The laughter, cold and deliberate, from the driver who had tried to run them down, it was the sound of a gauntlet thrown, not at my feet, but at the very heart of my family. My meticulous world, once ruled by the elegant precision of numbers, had splintered into jagged shards of fear and fury. I paced the confines of my study long after the house fell silent, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of my own pulse. This was no longer about exposing a financial crime. It was about survival. They had responded with veiled threats, with dismissive smiles, and now, with direct violence against those I cherished most. I could not fight this hydra alone. My thoughts drifted to a name, a ghost from a past life, a contact from my university days who had walked a different path, straight into the labyrinthine halls of law enforcement. He had always possessed a keen, cynical eye, a distrust of authority that I, in my younger, more naive years, had found troubling. Now it felt like a lifeline. Disillusioned, yes, but perhaps precisely because of that disillusionment, he might be willing to listen. I sent a coded message, an old joke only we would understand, to an anonymous burner phone I'd bought weeks ago. It led me to the edge of the city, to a place where the concrete teeth of industry gnawed at the sky. The air in the warehouse district, loading dock, camera blind spot was thick with the metallic tang of diesel and the faint, sweet decay of forgotten goods. The rain, a fine, persistent drizzle, had slicked the asphalt, reflecting the sparse, sickly yellow glow of a distant street lamp. I parked my car, killing the engine, plunging myself into an almost complete blackness, save for the faint glow of the dashboard clock. He was older than I remembered, lines etched around his eyes like riverbeds, his shoulders broader, though with a slight slump that spoke of burdens carried too long. There was no warmth, only a weary recognition. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice feeling thin, stretched. My eyes darted, scanning the periphery, searching for any telltale glint, any unnatural movement. The paranoia was a constant companion now. He didn't respond immediately, simply watched me, his gaze piercing through the gloom. "You sound desperate. That's a dangerous sound in this district." He gestured vaguely with his chin towards the cavernous, silent buildings around us. "Especially when you call a ghost out into the rain." I took a breath, the cold air sharp in my lungs. My family was targeted, directly, because of what I found at the firm. I laid it out, not everything, but enough, the essence of the money laundering, the international syndicate, the obstruction. I watched his face for any flicker of surprise, any sign that he already knew or suspected. There was none, only that deep, weary cynicism. "So the respectable firm has dirty hands. What else is new?" He scoffed, kicking at a loose piece of gravel. "You think you're the first to stumble onto something big and ugly. Happens every day. Most people learn to look away or they disappear." "I can't look away," I insisted, my voice hardening. "Not after what happened. I have proof. Ledgers, transactions, shell companies. I know how they are moving the money." He finally looked at me, a glimmer of something akin to interest in his eyes. "Proof, you say? And you brought it to me, the man who couldn't keep his own proof from disappearing." A bitter laugh escaped him. "You must be truly desperate. They shut down my internal channels, they threatened me, they tried to hurt my wife and daughter." I reiterated, the words tasting like ash. "I need someone who isn't bought, someone who understands how these things work, how to expose them." He leaned against a concrete pillar, the rain beading on his cap. "Exposing them is one thing. Living to tell the tale is another. You think the system cares? The system is them, Thomas. A small-time operation, we thought, local drug ring. Then it started unraveling, pointing higher to some offshore accounts, shell corporations. The names started getting familiar, too familiar. My breath hitched. Familiar how? Politicians, high-ranking officials, and a few names from very respectable firms just like yours." He stared past me into the inky blackness. The evidence, it was solid, airtight. We had warrants drafted, ready to move. Then poof, vanished. A paper shredder, a clerical error, a misfiled report, all of it. The lead detective, a good man, he fought it. They broke him. His career was over. Mine. Well, I saw the writing on the wall, a much larger network. If the corruption reached that high, if it could make entire investigations disappear, then what hope did I have? Was I simply walking into a larger trap, offering my head on a platter? The thought made me doubt my decision to reach out, to trust this broken, cynical man. Had I just made things worse? Had I endangered my family even more by bringing someone else into this impossible fight? "That's the wait that doesn't add up moment, isn't it?" he said, as if reading my thoughts. "The official narrative never quite fits the reality on the ground. I have ledgers, Thomas. I have names. But names are just names. I need to connect them to something undeniable, something that can't be misfiled or shredded, something public. And that, my friend, is where I might need a ghost to help I haunt the living." He looked at me, a flicker of grim determination in his eyes, cutting through the cynicism like a razor. "Show me what I have. But understand, once I show me, there's no going back. I'll be playing a game with no rules, and the stakes will be everything." The chill, colder than the damp night air, still snaked down my spine, a persistent serpent coiling around my resolve. An inside man. The words echoed not just in the quiet chambers of my skull, but in the very marrow of my bones. A dire prophecy, whispered from a source I could no longer trust, yet could not ignore. The city hummed with its usual indifferent rhythm, a vast, indifferent beast, but for me, its low thrum was a predator's purr growing louder, closer. My car sat, an island of false security, beneath the flickering, dying gasp of a street lamp. Then another, mirroring its silent advance. Not the usual nighttime wanderers, the harmless ghosts of the city's fringes. These moved with a honed purpose, a predatory grace that curdled my stomach, turning my insides to lead. My breath caught, a shard of ice in my throat, sealing off any desperate cry. How could they have known? How could they have found me so swiftly after that conversation? The inside man was not just a theory. He was an active agent, a puppet master pulling strings I hadn't even seen. They moved fast, converging. One, a hulking figure whose silhouette seemed to swallow the meager light, cut off my path to the car. The other, leaner but just as menacing, came from behind, his stride unnervingly silent. There was no time for thought, only instinct, sharp and brutal. I bolted, not towards the open street where I might find witnesses, but deeper into the labyrinth of the warehouse district. The air grew heavy with the scent of dust, stale diesel, and the metallic tang of forgotten industry. I heard their heavy footfalls, the rhythmic slap of their soles against concrete, gaining. The sound was a drumbeat of my impending capture, echoing off the corrugated metal walls. A metallic clatter as I blindly knocked over a precarious stack of empty pallets. The sound was a beacon, drawing them closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The hulking figure was almost upon me, his face a grim mask in the gloom. I twisted, a desperate pivot, shoving a handcart laden with empty crates into his path. The crash was deafening, a momentary reprieve that sent splinters of wood flying. I didn't wait to see if it slowed him, just plunged onward, blindly seeking escape, my heart racing like a trapped bird. A narrow gap, barely wide enough for my shoulders, between two colossal storage units. I squeezed through, scraping my side painfully, emerging onto a vast, open expanse, a loading dock. The wind whipped at my face, carrying the briny tang of the nearby river, a sharp contrast to the stale air of the warehouses. I knew this area, had studied maps of it, looking for vulnerabilities, for ways to circumvent the pervasive surveillance. My mind, usually focused on the meticulous columns of ledgers and the precise balance of sheets, now screamed survival, a camera blind spot. I sprinted towards it, a desperate gamble, my legs screaming in protest. Just as I reached the edge of the dock, a searing pain exploded in my side. The leaner figure had closed the distance, his fist a blunt instrument of bone and muscle. I stumbled, sprawling onto the grimy concrete, the impact jarring every bone. The world spun, a kaleidoscope of pain and fear, the smell of my own sweat suddenly overwhelming. His hand reached for my collar, his grip iron hard, pulling me upwards, my feet dragging uselessly. My fingers, slick with sweat and the grit of the concrete, brushed against something hard, unyielding, tucked deep within the inner pocket of his jacket. A small leather-bound notebook. Not a modern device, but an artifact, its edges softened by time, its surface subtly embossed with a symbol I couldn't quite discern in the fractured light, but felt strangely significant, like a brand. Instinct, raw and primal, surged through me, overpowering the pain. This wasn't just a random item. It felt like a nerve ending of the very network that sought to devour me. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I ripped it free, the leather tearing with a faint, protesting rip, a desperate trophy wrenched from the jaws of my pursuer. As I did, I kicked upwards with all my remaining strength, catching him off balance. He grunted, a strangled sound of surprise and pain, stumbling back, his grip momentarily loosening. It was enough. I fumbled for the heavy-duty service door, my hands slick with sweat and something else, a trickle of blood from my side, a hot, sticky testament to my close call. The lock clicked, a fragile barrier between me and the relentless pursuit. I pressed my back against the cold metal, gasping, my lungs burning, the stolen notebook a burning coal in my hand. My head throbbed, my ribs ached with a dull, insistent pain, and the metallic tang of fear coated my tongue, mingling with the coppery taste of blood. They were outside. I could hear their muffled curses, the frustrated thuds against the door, the frustrated shouts of the hulking figure. But they couldn't see me, not here. This wasn't a warning, it was an execution attempt. My former life, the neat columns of figures, the quiet hum of the office, the predictable rhythm of my days, it all felt impossibly distant, a dream from another man's existence, shattered into a million pieces. I slid down the door, my body trembling uncontrollably, the stolen notebook a heavy, meaningful weight in my palm. Its leather felt aged, worn smooth by countless touches, a silent testament to secrets held close. What truths, what damning revelations did it hold within its pages? I couldn't go home. My apartment, my car, my entire identity compromised. The firm, once my sanctuary, was now a viper's nest, its corridors crawling with unseen enemies. I was alone, hunted with nothing but a bruised body, a rapidly fading adrenaline rush, and this cryptic little book. The chase was over for now. The serpent of suspicion, birthed in a forgotten alley and fed by a deceitful whisper, had not merely coiled, it had constricted, its scales now pressing hard against my throat. An inside man. The question, once a stark echo, now felt like a dying gasp, a prophecy fulfilled in the most brutal fashion. The source, a fleeting shadow, had delivered its poisoned fruit. The message was terse, devoid of pleasantries, a digital shard of ice. New lead, midnight. A trap, my gut screamed, a lure. Yet the desperate hunger for a definitive truth gnawed at me, overriding caution with a reckless resolve. I had to know. I had to see. The air in the warehouse district, thick with the metallic tang of industry and the stagnant breath of the river, clung to me like a shroud. Headlights, distant and blurred, painted fleeting strokes across the corrugated steel walls, revealing nothing but the stark geometry of commerce. The designated spot, a cleft in the concrete jungle, was precisely as described. A loading dock, its ramp scarred by countless tires, nestled between two colossal warehouses, their windows like vacant eyes. A camera blind spot indeed. My breath plumed white in the frigid air, each exhalation a cloud of apprehension. I waited. My eyes, strained and scanning, saw only the dance of dust motes in the weak light, the outlines of forgotten machinery, the skeletal remains of what might have been a wooden crate. No figure emerged from the gloom, no cryptic package materialized. The message itself, a phantom limb of information, had been the true trap. My presence here, documented perhaps by some unseen eye, was the bait. This wasn't about gaining information. It was about creating a narrative. My narrative. My apartment, when I finally reached it, offered no solace. The quiet felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken accusation. The morning arrived with the harsh glare of an interrogation lamp. A summons awaited me, delivered by a junior colleague whose eyes, usually bright with ambition, were now clouded with pity and something akin to fear. The managing partner and the head of security, he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. They want to see you. Immediately. The managing partner's office, usually a sanctuary of polished mahogany and hushed reverence, felt like a cage. The air was thick, not with cigar smoke but with unspoken accusations. The managing partner, a man whose smile usually radiated corporate benevolence, now wore a mask of grim disappointment. Beside him, the head of security, a former law enforcement officer whose gaze could peel paint, sat like a stone gargoyle, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. "Thomas," the managing partner began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "This is deeply regrettable." He pushed a folder across the vast expanse of his desk, irregularities, significant ones. My heart, usually a steady metronome of logic, began to stutter. I opened the folder. Inside, a meticulously compiled dossier of my own undoing, fabricated emails, seemingly sent from my work account, authorizing transfers to shell corporations I'd never heard of. Scanned bank statements doctored with precision, showing deposits of astronomical sums into offshore accounts, each bearing a forged signature that eerily resembled my own. And then the kicker. A photograph, grainy but undeniable, of me standing precisely in the warehouse district, loading dock, camera blind spot last night. The timestamp was accurate. These transactions, the head of security interjected, his voice flat, total nearly $30 million, diverted from client funds. The shell corporations, we've traced them to a network of illicit operations, and my presence, Thomas, at this rendezvous point at that specific hour while these transactions were being initiated. He let the implication hang, a poisoned arrow quivering in the air. These signatures are forged. I was lured to that dock. There was no one there, nothing. The managing partner sighed, a sound heavy with theatrical regret. "We understand this must be distressing for you, Thomas, but the evidence is overwhelming. Your access to our systems, your knowledge of our financial architecture. It all points to a deliberate, calculated act of embezzlement, or perhaps corporate espionage. We have no choice but to suspend your employment, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Your access to the firm's network has already been revoked. Your office will be secured. We advise you to cooperate fully with the authorities we will be contacting." Authorities. The word tasted like ash, my own firm handing me over to the wolves. You can't honestly believe this. I've been investigating a money laundering scheme, a syndicate. This is their retaliation. They're framing me. The head of security merely raised an eyebrow, a gesture of dismissive skepticism. "An elaborate tale, Thomas. Convenient given the circumstances. We found certain files on your personal drive. Encrypted, highly sensitive client data. Data that should never have left the secure server. Data that could only be accessed by someone with your level of clearance." Another blow. They had planted evidence, not just digital but physical, twisting every clandestine move I had made, every precaution I had taken into an act of betrayal. My attempts to gather evidence against them had been meticulously documented, then twisted into proof of my own guilt. The encrypted files, the ones I had painstakingly copied for my own protection for proof, were now my undoing. Wait, that doesn't add up. How could they have accessed my personal drive? It was password protected, separate from the firm's network. Unless the inside man had been even deeper than I imagined, a ghost in the machine, privy to my every digital step. I was being cut loose, cast adrift in a storm of manufactured evidence. The firm, my professional anchor, was now the instrument of my isolation. As I walked out, the faces of colleagues, once friendly, now averted or etched with a mixture of shock and pity. No one met my eye. My first thought was for my family. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling, a call to my wife. It rang once, twice, then his voice, tight with a brittle anger I had never heard before. "Thomas, what have you done?" The firm called, they said you've been stealing, embezzling. They said you're involved with criminals. Her voice broke, a raw, wounded sound. "Is it true? Tell me it's not true." The accusation coming from her was a blade twisting in my gut. They had gotten to her first, poisoned her against me. My carefully constructed life, my reputation, my sanctuary all crumbling, dissolving into a bitter dust. The syndicate wasn't just targeting my career, they were dismantling my very existence, brick by painful brick. I tried to explain, to plead, but her sobs drowned out my words. The line went dead. I was alone, truly, utterly alone. The world had turned its back, convinced of my guilt. Was I wrong? Had I misjudged? Had my pursuit of truth been nothing more than a fool's errand leading only to my own ruin? The syndicate, unseen and insidious, had struck with surgical precision, leaving me framed, isolated, and teetering on the precipice of utter destruction. The serpent had found its prey, and its venom was already coursing through my veins. They had cornered me, yes, but a cornered animal is often the most dangerous. The accusation coming from her was a blade twisting in my gut. The syndicate wasn't just targeting my career, they were dismantling my very soul, brick by meticulous brick. I had nothing left to lose, a chilling clarity that settled in the hollow space where fear once resided. The gray light of dawn found me not in my own bed, but hunched over a cracked tablet screen in a borrowed, anonymous room. The air was stale, tasting of desperation and forgotten lives. My fingers, once so adept at coaxing secrets from ledgers, now trembled slightly, yet the resolve hardening within me was absolute. They had taken everything. Now, I would take them. My mind, a labyrinth of numbers and interconnected deceit, began to rebuild not a defense but an offense. My unique accounting skills, the very tools that had led me into this abyss, would be my only weapon. They moved money like blood through a vein, intricate, precise, leaving only the faintest trace for the untrained eye. But I was no ordinary eye. Stripped of my firm's resources, I relied on memory, on the fragmented data I had managed to squirrel away, and on an intuition honed by years of sifting through financial lies. The previous night, a pattern had crystallized in my mind, a fleeting glimpse of a specific type of transaction, not for money, but for information. I had identified 3 such past instances, each linked to a specific date and time, each involving a minor data packet, but the sum of these packets, I now understood, formed a crucial part of their global network's nervous system, and I had a hunch about the next convergence point. If I was wrong, I was a ghost chasing another ghost, wasting precious time I no longer possessed. But if I was right, I could intercept a piece of their truth, a fragment that might expose the architects hiding in plain sight. The city awoke with a metallic groan as I moved, a phantom amongst the bustling commuters. I traveled by foot, by bus, by subway, shedding any predictable pattern, a deliberate act of vanishing into the urban sprawl. Each step was a calculation, each turn a choice weighed against unseen eyes. The weight of my small, worn backpack felt immense, though it contained little more than a cheap burner phone, a universal data stick, and the last of my meager cash. My destination was the warehouse district, loading dock, camera, blind spot. I knew the specific bay door, the one where the security feed always seemed to glitch, a convenient blind spot that spoke volumes of deliberate engineering. Towering metal structures loomed against the bruised sky, their corrugated sides pocked with rust. Gulls cried overhead, their calls mournful and distant. This was their domain, a kingdom of transactions and hidden agendas. I slipped into the alleyway adjacent to the targeted dock, the kind of forgotten space where refuse accumulated and secrets festered. The ground crunched under my worn shoes, gravel, broken glass, and something else, something gritty and unidentifiable. A phantom zone. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a dull drumbeat of impending confrontation. I was not a man of action, not in the physical sense. My battles were fought with spreadsheets and audit trails. But here, in this grimy, forgotten corner of the city, my intellect was my only shield, my only sword. I had to assume they knew I was still a threat, a loose thread, and they would be looking. I waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each one taut with expectation. Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil in my gut. Had I misread the pattern? There was my intuition merely a desperate grasp at straws. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, wavered. Perhaps this was a fool's errand born of a shattered man's delusion. The thought gnawed at me, a bitter taste. Then a low hum growing louder. A black panel van, nondescript and utterly unremarkable, idled to a stop directly opposite my hiding place, its engine a soft growl in the pre-dawn quiet. No lights, no markings, it was perfect. The side door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a single figure in the cavernous interior. Not the imposing figures I expected, but a smaller, almost delicate silhouette. A colleague. My breath hitched. Not just a colleague, but the assistant to the firm's managing partner, a quiet woman I'd shared countless coffee breaks with, discussing quarterly reports and the mundane office gossip. The other figure emerged from the driver's side of the van, taller, broader. It was the firm's head of security, a man whose reassuring presence had always been a fixture in the polished hallways of my former life. They exchanged no words, no greetings. A silent transaction. The assistant opened her briefcase, revealing a small, glowing tablet within. The head of security produced a similar device, connecting them with a short, thick cable. Data flowed, a silent flood of secrets passing between them, between the legitimate and the illicit. And then the reveal. As the transfer completed, the assistant's tablet screen briefly flashed a series of numbers and an image. It was a schematic, a complex, multi-layered diagram of a global financial network, far more intricate than anything I had ever uncovered, and at its very center a name. Not a corporate entity, not a shell company, but the name of the managing partner himself, illuminated in stark, unforgiving red. My breath caught in my throat. The obstruction, the threats, the deliberate dismantling of my life, it wasn't just complicity. It was orchestration. The very heart of my former firm, the man at its apex, was the spider at the center of this web. This wasn't just a money laundering scheme. It was a deeply embedded betrayal, a corporate empire twisted into a criminal enterprise. The assistant closed her briefcase, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. She looked directly at the camera blind spot, not at me, but at the empty space, as if acknowledging the unseen eye. A shiver traced its way down my spine. Had she known, there was this a message. The van door hissed shut. I stood there, frozen. The schematic of betrayal burned into my mind. I had a name. I had a direct link. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything I could have foreseen. My countermove had begun, but the true battle was yet to come. The accusation, a viper's tongue, had flicked against my soul, leaving a venomous trail. My sanctuary, once a haven of order and logic, now felt tainted, breached. But the dust of dissolution, though bitter, held a strange, gritty promise, the clarity of absolute loss. There was nothing left to lose, only everything to reclaim. My fear, once a chilling companion, had hardened into a diamond of resolve. They had wounded me deeply, but in doing so, they had forged a weapon. I found myself in a borrowed space, a forgotten corner of the city, where the hum of my makeshift server was the only companion. The screen's blue-white glow painted my face in stark relief, reflecting the intricate lattice of numbers and code unfolding before me. My fingers, usually precise in their dance across ledgers, now flew with a desperate grace over the keyboard, each keystroke a silent prayer, a whispered curse. This was the crucible where my meticulous nature would either save me or condemn me. I wasn't merely manipulating data. I was weaving a phantom, a digital ghost designed to haunt the syndicate's carefully constructed empire. My goal was not just exposure but strategic implosion. I constructed a multi-layered release. Some data, a mere appetizer designed for immediate public consumption, disguised as an anonymous leak. Other, more incriminating files were set to trigger a deeper investigation, encrypted and time-locked for specific, vetted recipients. My eyes, burning from hours of relentless focus, scanned lines of code, cross-referencing old internal communication logs with the syndicate's concealed ledgers. And then there it was. Not a buried report, not a disregarded warning, but a meticulous, almost imperceptible alteration within my own initial submission to the firm's compliance department. A digital fingerprint, so subtle, so cunningly embedded, that it spoke volumes of an inside job, far beyond mere obstruction. My early attempts to raise the alarm hadn't just been ignored. They had been actively sabotaged, twisted, and weaponized against me. The original files, still residing in an obscure corner of the firm's server, were subtly altered in their publicly accessible versions, adding phrases, shifting dates, creating a narrative that painted me as negligent, even complicit. It wasn't just a cover-up, it was a frame. This wasn't merely a network of criminals, it was a deeply entrenched, intelligent organism, anticipating moves, twisting truths, turning the very systems designed to protect into instruments of deceit. The stakes had just escalated from my career to my very liberty, perhaps my life. A rapid, coded message, a single phrase pregnant with meaning, flew across the ether to the journalist, my tenuous link to the world's insatiable hunger for truth. Then another, far more secure package of data, a link accompanied by a decryption key and strict instructions to await the public trigger, was dispatched to the contact within law enforcement. My hands, despite the adrenaline coursing through me, remained steady, but a tremor deep within my chest was a testament to the immense weight of these decisions. The die was cast. The fuse, though not yet lit, was laid. The night swallowed me whole as I navigated the city's underbelly in a rented, nondescript vehicle. The area was a sprawling monument to commerce and neglect, a labyrinth of corrugated steel and stacked containers reaching for the bruised sky. Each turn of the wheel felt like a step deeper into the belly of a beast. The only sounds were the distant hum of the city, a mournful siren, and the frantic thrum of my own pulse. I carried a small, innocuous package, no larger than a deck of cards, a micro SD card, disguised within a cheap plastic case. This was the physical trigger, the final piece of the elaborate mechanism I had painstakingly assembled. The air grew heavy with the smell of brine and rust as I approached the loading dock. My breath plumed in the cold air. The designated camera blind spot was precisely as described, a forgotten corner, shielded by a cleverly placed stack of empty pallets and the sheer bulk of a dormant, refrigerated trailer. Here, the electronic eyes that watched over the district were blind. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my movements were precise, honed by a desperate necessity. I knelt, feeling the rough texture of the concrete beneath my gloved fingers. Beneath a loose grate, nestled amongst discarded cigarette butts and dust motes, I found the prearranged activation point, a small, waterproof conduit. I slid the micro SD card into its slot, feeling the faint, satisfying click. Am I truly seeing all the angles? Have I accounted for their ruthless cunning? The syndicate's reach, I now knew, was deeper than I had ever imagined, their methods more insidious. What if this, too, was a trap? What if my carefully laid plans were merely pawns in a larger game I couldn't yet comprehend? But the doubt, though potent, was swiftly consumed by the inferno of my determination. There was no turning back, no alternative. The fuse was lit. The trap was sprung. I had crossed a point of no return, and the only path forward was through the fire. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of brine and diesel, a symphony of industry in its late-night slumber. My breath plumed, a fleeting ghost in the cold, vast expanse of the warehouse district, loading dock, camera blind spot. This was it, the crucible. The wind, a restless phantom, whispered through skeletal cranes and stacked containers, carrying the distant wail of a ship's horn, a lament, or perhaps a fanfare for the reckoning I had set in motion. My fingers, numb not just from the chill but from a tremor of anticipation, traced the cold metal of the rusted barrier I crouched behind. The clarity of absolute loss, as I had known it, was a brutal instructor. It had stripped away the fear of consequence, leaving only the stark, unyielding bone of purpose. I was no longer merely Thomas, the meticulous number cruncher. In my pocket, a small device hummed faintly, a heartbeat against my thigh. It was a digital lifeline, a secured conduit to a world outside the compromised walls of my former firm, a world that still believed in justice. The data, painstakingly collected, meticulously verified, lay coiled within its circuits, a viper ready to strike. It held the names, the dates, the offshore accounts, the illicit transactions, the entire putrid tapestry of their grand deception, spun thread by thread from the threads of countless ruined lives. A low rumble vibrated through the concrete, growing steadily louder. Headlights, twin predatory eyes, cut through the gloom. The loading dock, usually a hive of activity, now felt like a stage set for a private, deadly play. The sedan's door opened and the corporate executive emerged, his silhouette sharp against the distant city glow. His expensive suit, a mockery of integrity, seemed to absorb the scant light. He glanced around, a practiced scan, his gaze lingering, I imagined, on the very blind spot that concealed me. Beside him, a hulking figure, the syndicate enforcer, stepped from the van, his presence a palpable weight, a silent promise of brute force. My heart, usually a steady metronome, now hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Not from fear, not entirely. It was the adrenaline of the hunter, the final, terrifying moment before the pounce. One touch and the truth would spill, torrent-like, into the waiting hands of the authorities I had carefully cultivated, the ones beyond the syndicate's reach. The executive spoke, his voice a low murmur that barely carried on the wind. I couldn't discern the words, but the cadence was familiar, the smooth, unctuous tone of a man accustomed to command, to having his lies accepted as gospel. The enforcer merely nodded, a silent, menacing agreement. They were finalizing details, I knew, perhaps confirming the last transfer of illicit funds, the last erasure of digital footprints, believing their scheme was watertight, impenetrable. This was my moment. The clarity I had found in loss sharpened my resolve to a razor's edge. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs, and stepped out from behind the barrier into the pale, anemic glow of the dock lights. "Gentlemen," I called out, my voice, though steady, sounding strangely amplified in the vast silence. Their heads snapped towards me, a synchronized tableau of surprise. The executive's carefully constructed composure fractured first, his eyes widening in disbelief, then narrowing to slits of pure venom. The enforcer, a predator caught off guard, tensed, his hand instinctively dropping to his hip. I replied, holding up the small device, its screen now displaying a scrolling ledger of their crimes. The loose ends I tried to bury, the ones I thought no one would ever find. A flicker of something akin to panic crossed the executive's face, quickly masked by a predatory sneer. "I fool, do I have any idea what I am meddling with?" "I have a very clear idea," I countered, my gaze unwavering. "I have the numbers, the dates, the accounts, all of it. This doesn't have to get messy." His voice was a low growl devoid of any pretense of civility. "Oh, it's already messy," I replied, a grim satisfaction settling over me. "It's a full-blown catastrophe for I raised the device higher, my thumb hovering over the final activation button. The moment I press this, everything goes public. Every single transaction, every shell company, every dirty dollar. It's all going to the right people, the ones who can't be bought." The executive's eyes darted between me and the enforcer. His usual suave demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate, animalistic fury. "Stop him." I didn't hesitate. My thumb slammed down. A faint, almost inaudible beep confirmed the transmission. The data, my truth, was unleashed. I pivoted, narrowly avoiding the enforcer's outstretched hand. He was faster than I had anticipated, fueled by the desperate urgency of a cornered beast. I scrambled backward, tripping over a discarded pallet, my spine scraping against the rough concrete wall of a container. The device clattered from my hand, skittering across the grimy floor, still glowing with its silent triumph. "You idiot!" the executive shrieked, his voice raw with impotent rage. "You've ruined everything." The enforcer was on me in an instant, a heavy fist connecting with my jaw, sending a searing pain through my skull. My vision swam, the dock lights exploding into fractured stars. I tasted blood, coppery and warm, on my tongue. But even through the haze, a fierce elation surged. It was done. The data was out. Who did I send it to? I met his gaze, my lips curved into a blood-streaked smile. "Everyone who matters," I rasped, my voice thick. "The world is about to know my dirty little secrets." A distant siren, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, pierced the night. It was a mournful, rising keen, a sound of impending judgment. The executive's eyes, wide with a sudden horror, swiveled towards the sound. The enforcer's grip tightened on my collar, his grip tight. He glanced over his shoulder at the approaching wail, then back at me, a silent, terrible calculation in his eyes. He could finish me, but at what cost? The sirens were closer now, unmistakable. They were coming for them. He shoved me violently against the container, my head hitting the corrugated metal with a dull thud. My legs gave out and I crumpled to the ground, my body a symphony of aches. But through the pain, through the throbbing in my head, I could see it, the executive's face, a mask of utter despair, the enforcer's grim acceptance. The game was over. The sirens crescendoed, a deafening roar as flashing blue and red lights painted the grimy walls of the warehouse district, reflecting off the loading dock, illuminating the camera blind spot that was no longer blind. My breath hitched, a ragged, triumphant gasp. The clarity of absolute loss had led me here, but now, in the glare of those flashing lights, a new clarity dawned, the profound, undeniable victory of truth. The wail of the siren became a shriek, a banshee's cry rending the night sky above the warehouse district, loading dock, camera blind spot. It was not a single sound, but a chorus growing, encompassing. Floodlights, harsh and unforgiving, bloomed from unseen angles, bathing the cracked asphalt and corrugated steel in an artificial noon. I blinked, my vision momentarily lost to the glare, but my ears drank in the cacophony of screeching tires, slamming doors, and the urgent shouts of approaching figures. The executive, a man whose polished veneer had finally shattered, stood frozen, caught like a moth in the sudden brilliance. His face, once arrogant, was now a canvas of abject terror. The two shadows who had loomed with such menace dissolved into the periphery, attempting to melt back into the deeper pockets of night, but the net had been cast wide. The other, swifter, perhaps more seasoned, vanished, swallowed by the labyrinthine alleys between the hulking structures. My breath hitched. Hands, firm but not rough, guided me away from the immediate chaos. A voice, calm and authoritative, spoke my name, confirming my identity. He looked at the executive, now cuffed and kneeling, his expensive suit rumpled, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. "We have him, Thomas," the detective said, his gaze returning to me. "And the evidence." The air still thrummed with residual adrenaline, a phantom hum in my veins. My body, which had been a taut wire for weeks, now sagged, heavy with a weariness that seeped into my very bones. I watched as the scene transformed from a silent, deadly tableau into a bustling hive of activity. Forensic teams, their blue gloves stark against the grime, began their methodical sweep. Cameras flashed, documenting the fallen pieces of a grand criminal design. Hours later, the raw edges of the night began to soften with the first blush of dawn as I sat in a sterile room, recounting my ordeal for what felt like the 100th time. My voice, hoarse and thin, painted a mosaic of ledgers and lies, of veiled threats and desperate gambits. The detective listened, occasionally interjecting with a precise question, filling in the gaps with details only law enforcement could possess. Your executive wasn't just facilitating. He was a linchpin. We've uncovered a network of shell corporations, offshore accounts. The scale of it is staggering. Senior figures. It was not just one rotten apple, but a pervasive rot that had spread through the very core of the institution I had once held in such high esteem. This was the reveal. It wasn't just a few bad actors, it was systemic. The prestigious firm, a bastion of financial integrity, was nothing more than a gilded cage for criminals. The thought left a bitter taste in my mouth. The news broke like a dam. The headlines screamed, a cacophony of scandal and disgrace. My name, once an obscure footnote in the firm's directory, now appeared cleared and vindicated, though often overshadowed by the larger narrative of corporate malfeasance. The firm, a titan of industry, crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. Stock prices plummeted, clients fled, and the regulatory bodies descended like vultures. I watched it unfold from a distance, a strange blend of satisfaction and sorrow swirling within me. The truth was out, but at what cost? My phone, once a silent sentinel, now buzzed incessantly with calls from former colleagues, some offering hesitant congratulations, others expressing shock and disbelief. Each ring was a reminder of the chasm that had opened between my old life and this new, uncertain one. My career, once a meticulously charted course, now felt like a ship adrift. The numbers, my old companions, no longer offered the same solace. They were tainted, imbued with the memory of deceit and danger. The detective visited me a few days later, a folder tucked under his arm. He's singing, Thomas, giving us names, locations. Your information cracked this thing wide open. He then showed me photographs, grainy images from surveillance cameras, not from the loading dock, from other points in the district, capturing the movements of the syndicate's operatives. We found this particular loading dock, he pointed to an image of the specific area, was a designated drop-off point for large cash transfers, chosen for its isolation and the known camera blind spot. Your executive used it repeatedly. I stared at the image, the very spot where I had faced my fear, where the truth had finally broken free. We've crippled it, but these organizations, they're hydras, Thomas. Cut off one head and another might grow. We've done significant damage, enough to send ripples through their operations globally, but finished. My name was cleared, the firm was in ruins. Justice, in its own slow, grinding way, had been served. Yet I felt no triumphant surge, only an immense emptiness. The quiet life I had so carefully constructed was gone, shattered by the pursuit of truth. The meticulous order I once cherished had been replaced by a chaotic landscape of suspicion and memory. Was it worth it? My family was safe, that was paramount. But what of Thomas, the man who meticulously balanced ledgers? He was gone, replaced by a weary survivor, forever marked by the labyrinth he had navigated. The tension had not evaporated, it had merely shifted, settling deep within me, a permanent resident of my transformed self. The silence, once a welcome balm, now felt like a vast, echoing chamber within me. The firm, a name whispered with reverence and now spoken with disdain, was shattered. My own name, salvaged from the wreckage, still carried a faint, phantom scent of ash. Justice, a word I'd once trusted implicitly, had proven itself a slow, grinding mechanism, leaving behind not triumph, but a profound, almost paralyzing emptiness. The quiet life I had so carefully constructed, layer by meticulous layer, was gone, irrevocably altered by the tremors of the truth. My days began with a peculiar weightlessness. My wife, her eyes still holding a shadow of the fear she'd endured, would touch my arm, a silent query in her gaze. Our child, oblivious to the deeper currents, would laugh, a sound that pierced the lingering quietude and stirred something fragile within my chest. They were my anchors, the vibrant colors in a world that had threatened to turn entirely gray. We walked in parks, the green expanse a balm to my weary mind. I watched my child chase pigeons, a small, unburdened joy. My wife would hold my hand, her grip firm, a silent testament to our shared ordeal and our unbroken bond. We spoke little of the past, not yet. The wounds were too fresh, the scars still forming. Her gaze, once filled with apprehension when I looked distant, now held understanding, a shared resilience. We were not merely surviving, we were slowly, painstakingly beginning to mend. The fissures in our foundation had shown us its true strength. Yet a restlessness stirred within me, a phantom limb ache for purpose. The numbers, once my enemies, now felt like old, familiar friends. I saw patterns everywhere, not in ledgers, but in the mundane rhythms of life, a constant reminder of the intricate structures I had once navigated. And that knowledge, I realized, was a burden I could not simply shed. One overcast afternoon, a quiet compulsion drew me to the edge of the city, to a place where the concrete gave way to the rough-hewn edges of industry. I found myself walking through the warehouse district, loading dock, camera blind spot. The air hung heavy with the scent of diesel and damp concrete, a metallic tang that bit at the back of my throat. I stood in the exact camera blind spot, a place I had identified on grainy surveillance maps, a small pocket of invisibility in a world designed for observation. Here, the world had once been hidden, transactions veiled, and the truth obscured. A shiver traced its path down my spine, not of fear, but of profound recognition. This place, once a symbol of everything I had fought against, now felt different. It was a monument to the insidious power of greed, yes, but also a stark reminder of the fragile victory I had helped secure. My gaze drifted across the corrugated metal walls, the stacks of crates, the forgotten pallets. My mind, a meticulous instrument honed by years of sifting through deception, began to work. It wasn't about the old numbers, the figures of the past, but about the future asterisk ones. The system still existed, the vulnerabilities remained. The schemes I had unearthed were but a single branch of a sprawling, poisonous tree. Who would watch these blind spots now? A quiet conviction settled over me, firm as the concrete beneath my feet. My journey had stripped me bare, taken everything I thought I was, and forged something new in its place. I could not return to the quiet, oblivious life. The knowledge I possessed, the skills I had honed in the crucible of danger, were now a responsibility. I thought of the detective who had believed me, the quiet strength of his resolve. I thought of the countless others whose lives were touched by these unseen criminals. My purpose had shifted. The intricate dance of debits and credits, once a mere profession, now felt like a calling. There were vast, uncharted territories of financial malfeasance, intricate webs waiting to be untangled, and a quiet, persistent voice within me insisted that I was uniquely equipped to navigate them. The emptiness that had clung to me began to recede, replaced by a nascent stir of something akin to resolve. It wasn't the triumphant roar I might have once imagined, but a steady, persistent hum, like a well-oiled machine finding its rhythm. The quiet life was indeed gone, but a new one, perhaps more meaningful, was unfurling before me. I would seek out the quiet agencies, the governmental bodies, the dedicated individuals who fought the unseen wars against financial crime. I would offer my meticulous mind, my hard-won experience, my unwavering determination. My family, my wife, my child, they were the heart of my new horizon. And for them, and for the world I now understood with such stark clarity, I would find a new purpose, one built not on the fragile illusion of safety, but on the enduring strength of truth, meticulously unearthed, relentlessly pursued. I would learn to cast my own light.